Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dora Kampisch, and I'm the psychology program chair from this year. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our next keynote speaker, Nora Newcomb. So Nora is a professor of psychology at Temple University. She has done a wide range of work in cognitive development, cognitive psychology, cognitive science, in a range of topics ranging from episodic memory, reasoning, and spatial thinking. And today she will be talking to us about cognitive maps. Thank you, Nora.
So, thank you very much, Dora, for the invitation and for helping to arrange the symposium that's going to come after this. I'm very excited to talk to a different group than I usually talk to. And without further ado, I wanted to talk about one example of a claimed mental representation, namely the cognitive map. So, here's the plan for today. I am not going to consider accounts of spatial thinking and spatial navigation that rely purely on associative principles, although there were some, and I think there still are some, or perception action ideas, just sensory motor ideas. So in a way, I'm going to take, well, actually not in a way, I am going to take the existence of some kind of representation for granted. If you want, I can talk more about why I think the simple associative sensory motor accounts don't work. But I'm going to concentrate in the first part of the talk on the format of the representations, and in particular on a debate that's arisen recently about whether or not there's a cognitive map as opposed to what's been called a cognitive graph. And I'll explain the difference in a moment. And I'm going to argue that whether or not you see a graph-like or a map-like representation actually depends. That sometimes you can see one, sometimes the other, and it depends on environmental variation and on individual differences. So I'll show you some evidence relevant to that. Then I'm going to move on to development and discuss two theoretical approaches to development. One is nativism, or sometimes called core knowledge, which has been an approach to development that has been taken in many domains of cognition, but in particular in the spatial world, there's something called the geometric module hypothesis, which I will explain and then attempt to debunk. But I will go on to the view that I think is the viable one and really the exciting one, which I'm calling the emergentist view. So I also have a preamble, though, and before I get started, I wanted to point out that although a lot of times people use the term spatial cognition in the singular, I think that's wrong. I think there are two very distinct domains of what you might call spatial cognition. One is navigation, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And both the cognitive map hypothesis and the geometric module hypothesis relate to navigation. And the other is what I'm calling here small-scale spatial skills, with one example being mental rotation. And the contrasts between them are many, but in particular, navigation is something that any mobile species does. If you move in the world, you must navigate. Whereas the small-scale spatial skills are most relevant to tool use. And although, monkeys kind of use tools, crows kind of use tools, tool use is really kind of the big thing for our species. And it occurs in reaching space. So then the other contrast is scale. Reaching space is much smaller than navigable space. And the navigable space is widely agreed to use both body-centered cues, such as inertial, the feel of your body as it moves, the visual flow as things move past you, and also distal landmarks, sometimes called an allocentric framework, an other-centered or geocentric, sometimes it's called, framework. So today we're just going to talk about navigation. So cognitive maps are both venerated and have been debated for their entire history. They date back at least to Edward Tolman, who you can see in the upper left there, who did an experiment which was actually part of the cognitive revolution in psychology, which questioned stimulus response approaches to psychology in this maze at the middle top called the sunburst maze. So rats were initially trained to go into the round chamber, which is the start chamber, go straight ahead, turn left, turn right again, and then they get, a piece of cheese. I mean, actually, it's usually a chocolate pellet, but rats like chocolate better than cheese. So after training to do that, the question is whether when that route is blocked off, as you see it is in the sunburst situation, which of the other tunnels out will they pick in order to go get their reward? And the answer is that although they don't always pick the exactly correct tunnel, and I don't want to overemphasize how ballistic they are in their choice, they mainly go what would be northeast if the top of this is north, barring they might get a wrong tunnel to the left or the right, but they go generally in the northeast direction, showing that they formed some kind, or Tolman argued that they formed some kind of map of the situation. And famously, shown in the bottom left, John O'Keefe and Lynn Nadell wrote a book called The Hippocampus's Cognitive Map, in which they argued not only for the cognitive map hypothesis, but for a particular brain structure as being the seat of the cognitive map. Now, this has been debated ever since it's been proposed by various people, and I'll just point to one long-standing debate, which is between Rudiger Weiner, who studied ants, and the other one being, wait a minute, Menzel, Randolph Menzel, who studied bees. I often get him mixed up with a different Menzel. Anyway, they've gone at it for so long that I'm not going to take you through it. This box chart in the middle bottom is somebody's attempt to characterize the historical back and forth between these two figures. There's some possibility in my mind that there's a difference between ants and bees. Bees perhaps form cognitive maps and ants perhaps don't, but these two figures don't see it that simply. Anyway, moving on to humans, the debate between cognitive maps and cognitive graphs arose because of a particular proposal by William Warren, who's at Brown University, and Misun will talk a little bit more, I think, about his specific experiments, that what humans form is a cognitive graph, not a cognitive map. So what you can see in the middle at the bottom is the idea that there are certain nodes, which are presumably marked by particular landmarks, that are joined by routes that you have taken. And you know roughly the lengths between the nodes, and you know roughly the angles where the nodes are, whether you're going straight ahead or turning sharply to the right or inclined to the right and so forth. But what you do not know and cannot infer is the relation between the nodes, except that you have not directly traversed. So say the diagonal and the lower left between those two buildings. Other than if you go, what would be north and then east and then southeast and then south to get from the building, the sort of palace-like building to the more modern building. So this would be time wasting or time consuming and also fraught with error, because remember, each of those distances and each of those angles is only known roughly. So insofar as you could integrate, it would be a costly and error-prone process. And his experiments tend to show that humans are indeed very bad at integrating information and easily form representations that are logically impossible. Now, the cognitive map alternative in the lower left is often described as Euclidean, although then it's shown with, Cartesian axes, and I think that's a little confusing because it could be polar axes, or I think we're agnostic as to really what the axes are. But the important idea is that there's a common framework that links all of the landmarks in the environment, such that if you have formed this common framework, the so-called inferences come pretty much for free. The landmark framework is enough that everything is fixed with respect to it, so you don't really need to have traversed the distances or the routes between any particular set of landmarks in order to know the relation. So a few years ago, Michael Peer, Eva Bruneck, Russell Epstein, and I wrote a TICS paper in which we argued that really it's not an either-or proposition, but indeed that you can do both, and that it depends on the circumstances. So first of all, and you're going to hear more about this in the symposium, environments matter. So elements in the environment that support map-like representations are open environments, because then you can see what's around you and you have perceptual access to a common framework. Or perhaps grid-like cities, because then the grid provides the common framework and you don't really have to build it, especially if the streets and avenues are numbered. Now, in the longer run, that may rot out your ability to form cognitive maps when you don't have access to a grid, but in terms of forming a cognitive map for the city, it would be helpful. In other instances, that's actually quite difficult. So if you're in a dense forest, or if you're in a really complex building with not very many windows, you really don't have access to those distal or allocentric or geocentric frameworks that you need. So you really might form routes. And tellingly, experiments are often done in mazes, which exactly are those enclosed environments where it should be difficult to form cognitive maps, including all of Warren's experiments are done in mazes. So that's one of my chief beefs about Warren's approach. And I wanted to show you, not in detail, but to point you to an experiment out of Russ Epstein's lab with Michael Peer and Kathy Nadar, which really supports this idea. So you can see that there's an array of boxes, which is identical across the three conditions. These conditions are between subjects, so not everyone experiences all of the environments. You're either in an open maze with distal landmarks like a Ferris wheel, and you go from room to room and you collect a treasure in each room and so forth. Or you're in a closed maze where there's a wall around each environment. You collect your reward, you go through a tunnel to the next room, but you have sort of sensory motor access to what direction you're going from room to room. Or truly confusingly, you're in a closed room, and the way you go from room to room is to push a button to be teleported. So the responses of the open maze participants were more consistent with the Euclidean structure of the environment. I think you can immediately sense how this would be true. And the responses of the closed maze and the teleport maze participants were more consistent with a cognitive graph representation. Personally, I think it's a miracle that anybody formed any kind of representation in the teleport situation, but apparently some people did. Anyway, it's a long and complex paper, but that's really the gist of it. Environments matter. I also wanted to go on to the point that people differ. And this is a paper that's, well, not the end point, but a recent paper from an environment called Silkton that a group of us, headed pretty much by Steve Weisberg, started in about well, we started it in about 2010 or so. The first publication is 2014. It's called Silkton, and it's modeled on a campus environment. And what happens in it is that you take a route, say it's the red route, main route A. So you go from end to end and then back again. And then you take another main route, the dark blue route, and you go from end to end and back again. And then later, and sometimes it's a day or a week later, sometimes it's just in that one experiment, you experience the two connecting routes, which are shown in purple, which should serve to pin down the relationship between the two routes, but that isn't experienced directly. You just go from end to end of one mauve route and end to end of the other mauve route. And what we have seen repeatedly, and just ignore these different red and blue clouds, which anyway largely overlap, and you can see that what you get are three groups of people. The people in the lower left, this is, by the way, error in pointing. So 0 degrees if you point right at it, and then, that's very bad if you're supposed to be pointing this way. So lower is better on this graph. The people in the lower left are people who both have a firm knowledge of the routes, the main routes, and a firm knowledge of the relationship of the points on the main routes. The between route, the arguably have to be inferred relationships. The people in the lower right are people who know the routes but are not inferring the between route representations, and the people in the top right are the people who don't even form a very accurate representation of the route they took, which makes inference very difficult. So we've done quite a lot. I mean, you may be thinking, which of these am I? People always think that. And also, how come people are in these different groups? There are some differences in terms of some background skills, working memory, mental rotation, which I just said was different, but it sort of relates anyway. Perspective taking, other such things. We did try motivation, in case you're thinking the people in the top right just didn't care. We offered people money for doing it well, but it didn't make them any better. So I don't know if that's decisive, but we did try that. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. Okay. Geez. You can get a quick preview here. Okay, so this is the only experiment I'm going to take you through in any kind of detail. The objection that Bill Warren had to some of these demonstrations was that there's not really a true inference. Some of the between route relationships in Silkton can be glimpsed one from another. There are a few that can't be, but you're left with not too many pairs that are sort of truly inferred. So what I did with Marva Tonson and Tim Shipley, this is Marva's dissertation, was a 3-route environment that we're calling Copetown. So you experience all 3 of the main routes, the blue one, the red one, and the yellow one. And then you experience 2 connecting routes. This is actually a week later in this experiment, the 2 ones in mauve. But note that in this condition, and we counterbalanced everything, in this condition, the people did not experience a direct route from the red route to the yellow route. So those are truly either inferred because everything is embedded in a common framework, or inferred in a slow, costly, error-prone way by going along the nodes. So this gets at the idea that the signature of a common map, as opposed to a graph or a labeled graph, which is the same as a cognitive graph, and the survey is the same as cognitive map, is the idea of a common reference frame. So yeah, they learn the route, and then they do the pointings within the route, and 1 week later they experience, as I said, then they point between experienced trials and inferred trials. And what do we get? So we certainly replicate the finding that experienced connections, shown in green, are worse than directly experienced. Wait a minute. Experienced connections are worse? No, experienced connections. Oh, I see. The terminology, sorry. We're now calling it experienced connections for the ones that are directly linked by the mauve lines, and inferred connections for the ones that are not directly linked. So what used to be called between is in green, and it's a little worse than within, which is shown in yellow. What's also true, and what we didn't do before, is we retrain people a week later on the within routes, on the main routes. And what you see in dark blue is that people get better. So that's not surprising, but it does point to one of the things that we're missing in this experiment is that we don't necessarily give people as much experience as they each need to construct a cognitive map. And I think we've underballed the learning component of these experiments. So the second time they learn the main routes better, especially compared to the dark blue, which is the fair comparison. In green, they have a harder time with the Silkton type inferences. But what you can see at the right in the sort of purple color is that they're barely worse on the truly inferred connections. Now, of course, we were predicting they wouldn't be worse at all, so the fact that it's a rather small effect size leaves it somewhat ambiguous as to what's happening. We did move it to did a split between people who are good and people who are bad. We now don't get a significant difference between the green for the Silkton type inferences and the purple for the truly inferred, but that could be a lack of power. So what we move to is a node analysis. Remember I said that if you have to move along the nodes in the cognitive graph, it should be costly and error prone. And what's true is that these different relationships have different numbers of nodes in between them. So the less accurate group turns out to be affected by the number of nodes they have to go through. That's the dotted line in purple. So they're not affected for the ones they've directly experienced, even though they're quite bad, but then they are showing an upward slope for the ones that are truly the inferred ones. Whereas the people who are better are flat. So this again supports the individual difference approach, that the people in purple are truly forming a cognitive map as opposed to the other people. What I think is unknown is how much experience it would require for people to move into the cognitive map groups. So this is the optimistic part of me, that maybe all they need is a little more time. So the take-home messages from this part of my talk are that there are large learning effects, there's a large cost of integrating connected routes, which is interesting, but can be possibly overcome by learning. And there's only a small to small, moderate at best, probably quite small, additional cost of integrating across routes without a direct linkage. And in fact, for a group that's good at it, there's no additional cost. So the bottom line conclusion is that building cognitive maps is possible in the right environment, even probably for the people who aren't that good at it, but it takes time. So I want to move on to development, and I want to begin with the core knowledge or nativist hypothesis involving modularity. So the first thing I want to do is to make clear that what I mean here when I say modularity is not what neuroscientists sometimes mean when they talk about modules, which is kind of soft, not very formal modularity. What I mean, or what the field means, what the literature is about, is the kind of modularity that Fodor postulated when he wrote The Modularity of Mind way back when. So modular cognitive systems in Fodor's language are domain-specific, innately specified, hardwired, autonomous, and not assembled. Hardwired and not assembled seem to me kind of similar. Autonomous seems related to modularity, as does domain specificity. But, anyway, it all goes together. And this is a persistent view, and it's evident in the recently published book, What Babies Know, by Elizabeth Spelke, which takes up the geometric module hypothesis, which she pioneered as it applies to human children. And I won't read this whole quote, but the main point is that the geometric module hypothesis of an innate module is alive and well in developmental psychology. So, what is this geometric module? This came out of work that was initially done by Ken Cheng with rats as his doctoral dissertation in the 90s, and in the 80s, and in the 90s was done with human toddlers in the Spelke lab. So whether it's a rat or a child, and subsequently it's done with a great variety of species, like if you name a species, someone has probably run this paradigm with that species. You're in a rectangular room, and there are therefore two congruent corners, two pairs of congruent corners. In one of them, the long wall is to the left of the short wall, and the other one, the long wall, is to the right of the short wall. So they're distinguished, they're all 90 degrees, but they're distinguished by the sense relations of the two walls. And things are hidden that the organism wants, chocolate pellets for the rats and toys for the kids, in the four corners. And the kid observes the hiding in one of four identical boxes. The rat actually has to be trained to this paradigm to know initially that one of the corners is the correct corner. You can't just tell the rat or show the rat. You have to do some training. If it's chocolate pellet, you may be wondering about odor, but there's ground up chocolate all over the arena. It must be horrible for the rats, but there's only one that they can actually eat, so they are motivated to find the edible one. The kids are motivated to find the little duck just because they like little ducks. And, so there are species differences in how you do this. But the crucial thing for both and for any species you run in this paradigm is that you disorient them. You get rid of all the body-based cues that they could have been using to just go towards the correct corner. So now they have to rely on their ability to have coded and to remember the length of the walls and the sense relationship between the walls. So what the claim of the geometric module is that in the white room, all white room, where you have no way of distinguishing, everybody, as they ought, has a chance relationship between the correct in C and the reversed congruent corner R. And you can see that's true in the lower left. Also, well, on the left side of, both figures. And crucially, with the colored wall on the right side of both figures at the bottom, you can see that children still do the chance split. These are children of around 18 months and 2 years, also 3 years, also 4 years, do the chance split. It's not until maybe 5 and certainly by 6 that you get away from that. What I'm showing here at the very far bottom right is the adult split, which is 96-4, and who knows why that, why did 1 or 2 adults go to the reversal corner? We'll never know, but basically adults have no problem with this. So the idea is that there's a big marked qualitative shift at the age of about 5 or 6 years. So there's an innately specified geometric module that gets you the I go either to the correct corner or the congruent one, but you cannot use, this is impenetrability. You cannot use the colored wall or any other allocentric cue to take you off of chance. And the further idea, because a nativist has to have some mechanism for developmental change, so the mechanism that nativists often appeal to is language. And the claim is that it's specifically acquisition of the terms left and right at around the age of 5, 6 that will take you off of chance and penetrate the hitherto impenetrable geometric module. And I'm only going to show you a little bit of what I take to be the contrary evidence. And this has been a long exchange, an exchange that still has Spelke thinking she's right, but I'm going to show you a couple of reasons why I think she's wrong. The first of which is really the very first experiment we ever did on this hypothesis, and then a second follow-up one that Amy Learmonth did when she did a postdoc with Lynn Nadell, both of which show clearly that featural cues, the colored wall, are only neglected in tiny rooms. The room that Spelke used was, apologies, I know you guys use the metric system, 4 feet by 6 feet. The point is, it's a closet. This is a very small enclosure. If you have claustrophobia, do not go into it. Whereas we used a moderately larger room, but with the same ratio, 8 feet by 12 feet, but still it has 4 times the area. So it feels quite a lot bigger. It's big enough to be a bedroom, but it's kind of a small bedroom. And if you're even in something as big as a small bedroom, then children as young as 18 months, here we have 60% to 24%, are off of the chance split. So geometric information is not encapsulated, at least not by 18 months, and hence it's not a Fodorian module. And furthermore, language is not necessary to combine featural with geometric information because 18-month-olds barely talk, let alone know the left and right words. So actually, I thought this was pretty decisive, but the debate went on. Rather than pursue it too much, I want to point out something that I think is important and that's going to be more important as I try to take you towards an emergentist view, which is that, and which is also important from the point of view of environmental variation, that natural ecology and the ecological niches that are our environment of adaptation almost certainly, almost never include regular geometric enclosures. Both houses and cages are part of a built environment, which is actually quite recent. So boundaries may not occur at all, as shown in the black and white pictures at the left that are taken from a very nice Psych Bulletin article by Adina Liu. And when they are present, as in that cliff face, they're often partial, they're often irregular, they rarely enclose you entirely in anything like a rectangular space with congruent corners. So our babies in cribs and our rats in cages are living in unnatural, arguably, very special environments to which they're reacting. And therefore, we did an experiment with a colleague who had a mouse lab in which we did what you can't do with kids, which is to rear them in round environments, to give them an environment in which they would not experience lengths and they would not experience angles. So we put them with their mums. We used mice because he had mice, but mice show the same effects as rats. They just sort of take longer to learn. Mice are much dumber than rats, but they show the same effect. I should hasten to say that. So, and if they're reared in rectangular mice, they pass the test. They go 75% of the time to the correct corner. But crucially, if you're a little mouse that is now kind of a biggish, almost mature mouse, if you were reared for 2 months in the circle, you make no use of geometry when you're first put into the rectangular environment. And therefore, geometry use is what Bill Greenough called experience expectant if you're put into an environment that has these characteristics, then your neural wiring is such that you will pick up on the lengths of the enclosure and the angles and the sense relationships. But if you're not in an environment in which they count, in which they're paramount, in fact, then you don't pick up on them because, hey, they're not there. So you can pick up on them, but it's contingent on the environment. And there's been more recent work on this out of a couple of animal labs, one of which is Tom Wills and Francesca Cacucci in London. So with that, I want to turn to an experience expectant view of development, which is the one that I'm interested in and which I think is still in development, which looks at behavioral development, both from infancy to adulthood, and the neural underpinnings, which are various brain areas, including the hippocampus, taking us back to hippocampus as cognitive map, including another area called the entorhinal cortex, where the famous cells called the grid cells, discovered by the Mosers in Norway, mainly lurk. There's also in human visual stream, the so-called ventral stream, various scene processing networks that include various place areas that are thought to be relevant. So we want to specify behavior. We want to relate it to the initial neural underpinnings and also to development in the neural underpinnings, which could be either maturational, it's going to happen no matter what, or also experience expectant or not. And this is where I want to say, this is a little photo of Bill Greeno. There's both experience expectancy, which I've defined, in which you inevitably learn from expectable input. But there's also, Greeno said, experience dependency. So there's a wide variation in the ability to form cognitive maps, as I showed you. Probably the sort of baseline ability to not utterly get lost has to be experience expected, because otherwise I think it would have been pruned out of the genome. But the ability to do this better is probably experience dependent. If you're in an environment where you can, where it's important, where you're motivated, where people teach you, etc., then you will develop a stronger ability, but that's somewhat optional. So I think that's really a key distinction and an important way in which we can think about the interaction of the neural system and the behavioral system. So one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time, this is one of the more recent demonstrations, is the development of something called place learning, which is the ability to use allocentric frameworks, distal landmarks, that kind of thing, to locate something in an environment. And this is an experiment that I modeled on a very famous rodent paradigm called the Morris water vase, after Richard Morris, who invented it. In the rodent thing, you throw a rat into a round swimming pool filled with milky water, and there are or are not distal landmarks. There's also a hidden platform that the rats don't like to swim, so they swim around frantically wondering what they're going to do. They discover the platform, and the issue is, can they learn where the platform is in relation to a direct landmark, which actually is pretty easy, something directly marking it hanging from the ceiling, or if that's not there, in relation to the framework. And crucially, when they're introduced to the round pool from different directions, because if it's always from the same direction, swim to the middle, turn left is a rule you could use. So it has to be from different directions. So, you know, you can't really throw little kids into pools of water. So although we used a pool, we used a different, no water. Instead, there were cushy tiles in the bottom where we hid a puzzle underneath. And we would give the kid a piece of the puzzle. This is one of those wood puzzles that you can put a cow in and a pig in and that kind of thing. So you give them, say, the pig, and you say, and you've shown them that the puzzle is hidden, but they can't see it or feel it. Actually, these are really cushy tiles. They have to go to the tile and remove it in order to find the puzzle. And we did this with both 18 to 20-month-olds and 21 to 24 months, guided by prior research that had suggested a real change then. And what you can see is that by two different measures, the light gray older toddlers did massively better than the dark gray younger toddlers, suggesting a qualitative shift in how this experiment is done and the capacity to deal with it at all. You'll see even the older toddlers aren't great. They have a long way to go to improve, but they can deal with it in a way that the younger toddlers cannot. Now, this would be less interesting. It would only be a piece of magic numerology, except that it is true across species and it is linked to hippocampal development. So this is probably a case of underlying neural maturation, perhaps sensitive to the environment. We don't know that for sure, but maybe purely maturational. So in this recent overview with a variety of folks who work with rodents and non-human primates, what we got together was different behavioral evidence and various neural evidence that converged. You might think, well, wait a minute, 21 months for a human is what for a monkey is what for a rat? Well, this is a little hard to do, but they have little different formulae for how old a non-human primate has to be the equivalent and how old mice have to. Weirdly, for rats, it's 21 days, not 21 months. The number 21 comes up again, so make of that what you will. That's probably a coincidence. But it's that age for everyone. And that's what is shown in, shown here. But what is shown here is more perhaps interesting. Forget about the top stuff, the colored stuff. Just look at the green lines, which are the E panel, which is what we know, which is actually very detailed. This is from the Lavenex lab in Switzerland, the developmental timeline of morphological maturation in the non-human primate hippocampus, and for various areas. And what you can see is that it is crucially happening over the 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 12th months of life. 3 months is about a year for a human. 6 months is maybe about 2 years. So you can see that perhaps what is happening is that a threshold degree of maturation for some of these areas of the hippocampus, and they vary, is being reached. For rodents, it's more studied at a cellular level than in terms of volume. The non-human primate work is volume. But what we know is that head direction cells are first, and that's not shown. Then there's crude place cells, and then there's grid cells, and that's at about day 21. So that's when you can first see place learning, and it's when you get a grid cell. Then there's further development so that, for instance, the place cells get refined. So I think we're beginning to tell a powerful cross-species, probably maturational account of the advent of place learning. Nevertheless, locomotion matters, and probably for rodents and for humans. Wills and Kikuchi have a review of this. Melissa Clearfield did a nice experiment 20 years ago about it. There's a lot of work even before the Clearfield paper by Joe Campos at Berkeley on the importance of crawling. So we know that spatial development is driven in humans by motor milestones. I'm not going to review that, but it's, I think, very important. What I want to take you on to is recent work in the human ventral visual stream, because this takes us back to a little bit of a nativist flavor. This is work done largely in Rebecca Sachs's lab at MIT, in which pre-locomotor infants show scene cell activity. That is, the areas in ventral visual stream such as, okay, OPA, PPA, MPA weirdly is, they call it MPA, it's retrosplenial cortex. Why don't you just believe me, because I know a lot of you are not neuroscientists, that the three areas in which the blue bar is higher than the green bar, even in pre-locomotor infants, what happens is they're stuck in the magnet, they look at these pictures of scenes, of objects, of faces, and of scrambled scenes. The question is there the bit of their ventral visual stream that in adults would be most responsive to scenes? Is that responsive in these teeny tiny babies? And then there's a control right at the right just to show that it's not like scenes are massively activating the entire brain, which is not true. So what they're getting is responsivity to scenes. And what they sometimes argue, because MIT is a hotbed of nativism, is that this shows that there's some kind of innate preparation. Well, they don't use the word preparation. I would use the word preparation. That there's an innate basis for navigation. But what we also know from work out of Danny Dilks's lab at Emory, and also out of the MIT lab. Freddie Camps worked first with Danny Dilks and then went to Rebecca Sachs. He now has his own independent lab. That well, we don't know if it's younger. By age 5, retrosplenial cortex makes distinctions that are relevant to building a cognitive map. It's only between 5 and 8 years that what's called the occipital place area becomes sensitive to self-referenced forward motion. That is, remember, visual stream, that you can track how far you've gone by how fast the visual stream is going past you. So we do know that it's only between 5 and 8 years for OPA, which is surprising because this is a kind of far back visual area, and on the view that you mature back to front, it ought not to be so late, but that's what they're finding. And we don't know for retrosplenial cortex if it would appear earlier, and we really need to know that. But what I want to emphasize is that lots is late. So quite a long time ago, Marco Nordini found that an important part of the navigation system, which is combining the visual information and the body-based information, doesn't occur until 8 or 10. And that is consistent with a lot of stories about optimal integration of our sensory systems. Actually takes quite a long time to develop and seems to be very responsive to experience. And what we found with Silkton is indeed that kids are not as good as grown-ups until around the age of 12 or 13 years. And more recently, with a different paradigm, we actually found continued improvement. So the 13-year-olds we saw were not as good as the adults we saw. So I think that altogether, there's a long and complicated story to be told here. There's a lot of gaps still, and I think that's really exciting to try to fill them in. Some of the research in the symposium will, I think, begin to do that by looking at cultural variation in what the environments and the culture and the pressures from the various cultures and environments do, probably to this developmental course. But the overview is that I do believe there are strong starting points. I wouldn't exactly want to call them innate just because it's such a loaded term, but they're strong. They're strong. But they're somewhat softer than representational nativism postulates. They're experience expectant or experience dependent. True representations emerge in developmental time. Well, this is the same point. Infant abilities are impressive, but they're not the adult state. And there's considerable variation by person and by environment. So there's really also no uniform adult endpoint. And that's my story. Thank you.